Our next speaker brings nearly 2 decades of web experience to his role as digital strategist at Lullabot. He is also co-author of O'Reilly Media's Using Drupal, the host of Insert Content Here Content Strategy podcast, and an active contributor to the Drupal project. He can be bribed with pictures of fuzzy animals. Please welcome Jeff Eaton.
Hi. So we've been talking about a lot of really interesting stuff, and it feels like the middle of the day, and getting towards the end of the day, we've been getting a lot of really interesting and meaty stuff about the mechanics of figuring out how things are going to work, how you improve the performance of a website, and stuff like that. I'm going to be going back to some of these highfalutin ideas that were being kicked around at the beginning of the day. Planning beyond the page. The original working title for this was "The Page is Dead," but that felt a little combative and maybe even mean-spirited. Again, as I said earlier, I'm Jeff Eaton. I work with a company called Lullabot. We do strategy, design, and development for content companies. Sometimes we work with organizations that are just purely producing websites and content as like a marketing component for something else. But the majority of the organizations we work with, publishing and providing content and information to the visitors or their clients or whatever is really a core part of their service. That could be like publishing and media companies, that's actually the product they deliver. It could be educational institutions where the information that they publish online is a key resource that they provide to people. So a lot of the experience that I bring to it revolves around content not just as an adjunct, but as like a really core part of what an organization does in their business. And this sort of ties in with the whole, page is dead thing. It's not that the idea of pages is going away. It's that it's problematic. Because the real issue is that pages aren't content. They're where content lives. This is a theme that I'm going to be returning to an almost annoying number of times through this presentation. The content that you produce and work with and put out there on a day-to-day basis isn't a page of something. It's a thing that lives on a page. And to introduce that idea, I'm going to tell a story. A friend of mine, a coworker, Blake, we were on site with a client. We'd been like an 11-month project. A bunch of us had been working on it, and we were the two ones that ended up getting sent to help push it over the final line during the launch. We were training their editorial team and helping the final, rollout of the site get working. And it was this, 1 week of long nights, sitting in the middle of, an office park in Connecticut, then going back to the hotel and recovering and starting again the next day. And finally, on Friday night, everything was like, all the I's were dotted and the T's were crossed. And we went back to our hotel and we went, hooray, we've done it. And it was a really fun, it was tired, but it was a peak experience from a year-long project. So we went into the hotel bar and we ordered drinks and we said, hurrah. And we were talking to the bartender. The bartender was an awesome guy, straight from an episode of Jersey Shore. Said, oh yeah, you do websites? Yeah, my cousin does websites. He makes mad cheddar. That was direct quote. And he said, yeah, he makes sometimes, $100 a page. And he's like, what kind of stuff do you do? And my coworker, who was actually relatively new to the company, this was his first project, and he'd mostly worked on smaller sites up to that point. And this one was like, yeah, this was a big project. He's like, well, we did the Grammys. The bartender's, whoa. He said, that's got to be a lot of pages. And it was funny because we laughed about it at the time, and we chuckled because it was like, well, it's like a modern CMS-driven website. We really only made maybe a dozen different templates for the whole site. Everything else was just stuff getting piped through and robots, reshuffling and rearranging things. But on the other hand, I guess from another perspective, there were thousands of pages on the site, but it makes sense on one hand, but it just totally doesn't represent what's actually being done on another. And it doesn't make, it's no wonder that there's a lot of confusion around this, both in the way people think about the web and web projects and in our terminology. This is like the super olden days. This is, a directory of one of the old websites I made like in 1990, old, we'll say. As a side note, one of my really sobering personal life experiences recently was discovering that we'd just interviewed somebody for a position who was younger than one of the HTML files I still had. But this is the olden days. There was a direct one-to-one correlation between a file on disk that you could go in and muck around with Notepad, and a URL that someone would visit in their web browser, and like a page that they would see, and the URLs were folders and files. Everything made sense. Why did we have to leave this behind? Of course, the downside is the web also looked like that. That's an actual screenshot from apple.com in like 1997. It has a wonderful, nice faded edged button bragging about the fact that they have a movie, moving pictures on the internet. The problem with this isn't necessarily that it wasn't cool and it wasn't simple, but that one-to-one correlation we had between a page, a piece of content that I'd created, a file on disk, also ended up really killing us when the design changed. Anybody remember the first major redesign they went through in that era? Going through, and either you ended up tossing everything and starting from scratch, which was okay if you had a small amount of content, or you ended up essentially like unraveling a sweater and trying to turn it into a scarf after the fact. That's what a lot of redesigns felt like. And you look at like the evolution of the Apple page, and it all makes sense. It's following modern design trends and stuff like that. But if you look at it from that old school perspective of, okay, so what are the files, and what are the pages, and what are the pieces of stuff we're making, that changes radically over time, even with minor design changes. And this is meat and potatoes web stuff. Not only did design changes kill us, but also the increasing amount of content that most organizations were trying to publish became more and more and more crushing. Every single one of those files, all the footers, and then we'd make include files and we'd sling it in there. But we were really juggling all kinds of balls just to keep a website running. And this is what I like to think of as like the John Henry era of web publishing tools. Does anybody know the Ballad of John Henry? See, he was a steel driver. They would go out there and would dig tunnels for railroads and stuff like that. And he was one of the guys that would actually take a big hammer and pound steel stakes into rock so that they had a place to put explosives and they could blow up tunnels. The Ballad of John Henry is all about this moment, this key critical time in the railroad history when somebody built a steam engine that could pound those spikes into the ground and essentially make all these guys who made their living pounding spikes completely irrelevant. And the story of John Henry is, he went out there and he went toe-to-toe with one of the steam engines, and he took a giant hammer in each hand and he pounded and he beat the steam engine, and then he died of a heart attack minutes later. And I've always thought that was a really wonderful metaphor for those early days of being a webmaster. Pages. We made engines to make more pages, more faster, so that we wouldn't have to go out there making more pages. But we were still really fixated on that idea of pages. And even today, tons and tons of tools, despite all of the advances we've made, lots of tools that still endures, not just in the terminology of what kind of page would you like, but in the idea that things we publish are pages on a website of different types or different appearances or different templates, but that a concept of the page as this sort of single unifying element has really stuck with us for a long time, and to our detriment. Because you can look at things like, what kind of page do you want? I want a rich text page, that WYSIWYG blob of stuff that Karen McGrain has talked about, or I want a form, or I want a gallery. Well, a gallery page sounds awesome. I don't have to do all the work. I don't have to write that by hand. But what if I also want a page for each one of the things in the gallery? What does that mean in a world where pages are the thing we're making? Well, it's terrible. And it goes beyond just this, how do I produce more? How do I produce more? How do I keep track of it? How do I keep up with the redesigns? It goes beyond that too. Because as we live in a world where the metaphor of the page dominates how we think about structuring and scoping and planning, we can get into a really nasty place where, and this is a slide that I'm pretty sure that Christina Halverson is never going to be my friend again, because I tweet this every time this comes up, and she says, Jeff, I hate you. This is pink slime, the stuff that is apparently chicken McNuggets are made out of, but apparently that's just a rumor. This is meat. Or, as I like to think of it, this is content being poured into a page. When we think about pages, when we think about, oh, well, we need to talk about a new product, make me a page for that. Well, the page is just a box. It's just a spot on the website. And if all we're really thinking about, if what we're fixated on is give me a new spot on the web page about this thing, ultimately the content that really does the work is going to be like this slime. It's just stuff that we're going to be pouring into a page because, well, now we've got a spot and now we got to put something in there. And templates can make that better, and standardized practices and designs that we know we're working from can make that better. But it's a real problem because we lose sight of the real essence of what we're doing. The meat is what matters, not just a thing that fills the form. And, this was basically a scaling problem when all we were talking about was the web. It was how can we keep up? How can we make more of it? How can we do more with less time? But then we started thinking about things like, mobile apps. Or in the multi-channel stuff that we've been talking about today, mobile apps and email. And, what about the stuff that shows up on our page when somebody looks at it on Google? Or what about feeds that people are going to be subscribing to, the if this, then that service that Dean talked about earlier? You can automate all kinds of stuff. Well, that means we've got to put out a feed. And can somebody print this stuff out? Oh, well, we divided it up into 4 pages so it was easier to read. There's no way to just print it. Or APIs, all the NPR COPE stuff. All of this is monstrously complex in and of its own right. But if we're stuck in a page-centric view of things, this is just a non-starter. We can't really do this stuff. If all of these things are just different ways to take a page and sling it out to somebody, we're doomed. The real issue here is that idea that there's a one-to-one correlation between an important unit of content that we want to make and spread and share, and that people might come to the site because they care about it. The idea that there's a one-to-one correlation between that and a page is the real heart of our problem. And if we think about it, like Karen McGrain was talking at the beginning of the day about the print metaphor that has shaped so much of our terminology and our metaphors and our understanding. Even if we look at the idea of print, look at a book, a page is not a valuable concept for someone who wants to read a book. You don't go, page 134 was awesome. That might be useful if you both have the same edition of the same book in the same format, and you're using that as a quick way to let someone know about a certain part. But what you care about is the meat of it. You want the words, you want maybe the stories, or the poems, or the figures, or something like that. The stuff that actually lives inside of it and just happens to be on a page. This is another Karen McGrain quote because, quoting the early speaker who everybody loved. That's always a good move. She said, the way that we publish on the web is mostly derived from what we know about putting ink on paper. And this was an article that she did for the Harvard Business Review. The second part, I think, is really telling. She said, the future is content in smaller, discrete objects that can be assembled into new containers. And that smaller, discrete objects thing is important. That idea of the poems or the stories or the chapters or whatever that we end up using to populate those pages, the things that have their own meaning and that people care about. Those are the small, discrete objects that we're really creating when we say, I need a new piece of content. The challenge is taking a page-centric view of the world, or a pile of content that's already been made, or a website that's already built heavily around this a page is a piece of content is a page. Taking that stuff and starting to tease it apart and figure out, okay, well, that's cool. Smaller, more discrete objects, that's cool, but how do I figure out what they are? For my website, for a real, actual project, what are those tinier pieces if I'm not just thinking in terms of pages and page types? There's a couple of different ways that people who are in the trenches with a website day to day can start trying to tease those pieces apart. One of the easiest ones is to think about your organization and just start describing, like, what is it that we do? What is it that we make? Are there particular services or products that we talk about? Are there particular people in our organization that we want to make sure we, let people know about? This is like the brainstorming and idea-oriented phase. You're trying to break out like all of the important nouns about your company. What are the bits that we might want to talk about or someone might want to care about? And then in like the field of content strategy and in content modeling, you also start looking in and saying on any one of those things, like an article, say, how do we tease out the individual little pieces of that? What are the conceptual parts of an article? There's title, author, dateline, summary, the body field, stuff like that. Starting to tease apart these like important chunks of stuff that we talk about and we communicate and people care about when they visit our websites or they, receive our mailings or whatever. And then figuring out what the individual little elements of those things that people care about are. That's really the heart of the content modeling's work that a content strategist might do or a developer is going to have to do when they actually build out a CMS for the website. Another thing that can be done is taking a look at existing content that you've got, existing pages that you have. Oh, there I said it again. And looking for reusable patterns, individual little chunks that occur on those pages that you go, hey, that's not a part of the whole page, but that's a unit that could probably stand on its own. Like, the average like front page of a website, or even like a topical landing page on a university's, on a university site or something like that, is going to have a bunch of stuff going on. But all of those individual things can be teased apart and thought of as individual pieces. This isn't just a single big aggregate blob of a page. It's a gallery showing several instances of a particular thing, or it's a map showing the location of our campus, or it's the bio of one of our founders or something like that. You take those things and you start saying, okay, well, where else do these appear on our website? Maybe there's interior pages and articles where we're using a bunch of the same little chunks. And maybe we're repeating that work, the old copy and paste joy of, going in and grabbing the, sidebar that you've used in a bunch of places and sticking it onto another page. We've mostly escaped from that, in a world of CMS-powered sites. But we don't necessarily think about those repeating elements as their own standalone pieces of valuable content. We can also do something that I think a lot of like people from a marketing or sales background are probably very familiar with. And that's talking about our site or our organization's like audiences, the people that we care about. That could be customers, or it could be visitors to a website, or it could be prospective students for an educational institution, or it could be alumni or something like that. What are the different audiences that we care about? And what are the messages we want to communicate to them and the things that they're trying to figure out? This is like that persona-oriented view of the world. Stepping back from the actual pieces of content and starting to think about this stuff can give us a very useful and different perspective. These three things, I think, are very complementary. And they also correspond to what a lot of people in different roles throughout the life cycle of a web project tend to be doing. That first one of, describing services and products and stuff like that. Oh, excuse me, I didn't realize my microphone was slipping down a bit. that's something that a lot of developers and content strategists and people who think about like IA and site architecture, they're probably very comfortable with that. Decompose the important nouns. What are the fields? What are the properties of all of our different objects? They're probably very comfortable with that. The second one of like looking at all the designs and identifying those repurposable patterns and stuff like that, that's the kind of stuff that it's very design-oriented thinking. And talking to the person who's working on like, mock-ups or, did the original design or something like that, they're probably going to be able to work through those kinds of questions very easily. And like I mentioned, that third one is a very marketing business stakeholder kind of thing. Who are our customers? What do we talk about? Why do they care? And those three things aren't independent. Those three ways of talking about and looking at the content, those don't have to be separate from each other. Those, they all feed into each other and can inform each other. Looking through the visual patterns of a website can inform the modeling work, where you say, oh, we need a new type of content called let's say, a testimonial. It may not live on its own page, but we want those to be able to sprinkle around throughout the website and other places. And you may only notice that once you've looked through a bunch of pages that have that as an important design element. And on the flip side, you may notice that, a bunch of our pages are just kind of missing something. They need a little more pop. And you may look at the content that you have at your disposal and say, oh, well, you know what? We have a lot of local events that are going on. I bet we could probably put those together into a map or something like that. We could, give people a real sense of place in a couple of these, pages that we've got. All of those things can inform each other. And the third one, it can help you identify a lot of overlooked opportunities, because in addition to like what raw materials do we have to work with, what's the stuff that our business does and produces, in addition to how are we presenting things, that third one can also show you things like, what do people care about? What are they looking for when they come here that we're not giving them? And sometimes that can help you identify stuff you should put online, and also stuff that you have been maintaining and put on your website that just no one actually cares about. That's sad, but if it means that it's less work off of your plate maintaining it, that's awesome. And the fourth one is also actually really critical for that, and that's in addition to all of those chunky, very detail-oriented things, there's also this idea of business goals. And this isn't just like, oh, well, we would like to increase sales and make lots of money, or we would like to have more donors come and give us money. All of those things, what we have, how we present it, what are the patterns, who are we talking to, there's also a question of what are we trying to accomplish putting this stuff out there? A lot of, we've worked with a shocking number of websites where there's not really a particularly clear goal of why we actually are trying to publish information on the internet. A lot of content marketing, I think, content marketing is awesome, and I think it's steered a lot of energy towards producing things of value for clients in order to, for customers in order to actually gain goodwill and gain trust. But left to its own devices, it can often become, well, we're putting it out there because we are supposed to put stuff out there. We are updating our website because that is what one is expected to do. Why is there a news section on the site? Well, we are supposed to have a news section. What sort of company would we be without a news page? Well, but what's being accomplished with that? Is the idea that we've got timely stuff going on really important and germane to the goals you're setting? And this is actually the interesting part, and where we start coming back to this concept of a page. The idea of all of those raw materials and all of those audiences and all of the messages that we want to communicate, and then those goals that we want to accomplish, circles around in this quote that Michael Kara, a guy in the Drupal community who's done a bunch of UX and IA work, he says that what we used to call the page has become a unit of business intent, which I sort of alternate between thinking, wow, that's deep, and thinking, oh, that's incredibly nerdy and businessy. And I'm not sure which it is. Maybe it's both. But the idea is that once we've started teasing out the idea of content that we create as being these important little atomic units. And we've acknowledged that pages are places that content lives. The idea of combining those units, combining our thinking about audiences and the messages we want to convey, and combining our thinking about the goals we want to accomplish, those things together actually give us really good tools for determining what pages ought to be on the site, what sections should we be defining. When we say, I need a page for X, those are the things that need to all come together to define that. A page, in sort of his way of thinking, is an assembly of content that serves a specific goal. Now, that page could be a single piece of content. But if it's just one piece of content sitting on the page, you should understand what the goal of that is. You should understand who's going to care about it. What message is it communicating? This is all this kind of stuff that, content strategists get super jazzed about. And, well, I kind of get jazzed about it, admittedly. But it's also a little abstract. It's a little vague. I've been waving my hands somewhat vigorously now because it's vague. So there's a couple examples I'd like to walk through. And these are all like real, actual websites that either, we've worked on, specifically inside of Lullabot, or people that I know inside of the community have dealt with. And they illustrate different sort of aspects of this. One is a project called the Lark Cookbook. And this is a great example of that idea of taking these concepts. What is the essence of a cookbook? It was this chef who owns a cool, trendy, hipster restaurant in Seattle that decided he wanted to make a cookbook that captured his belief about the essence of, cooking in the Pacific Northwest. But to make that a reality, it had to be turned into actual concrete pieces that could be created. Now, the end result was really awesome. There's a website that you can go to, the Lark Cookbook. There's also an iPad app. There's the Amazon Kindle version of it. There are cooking videos that are embedded in this stuff. It's like an incredibly rich, vibrant cooking, experience. It's all kinds of fun stuff. I haven't actually managed to successfully cook any of the recipes in it. That is a testament to me, not the quality of the cookbook. But under the hood, behind all this cool stuff, this is their model of what the essence of cooking is. Now, there's a couple of things that are obvious in here, a recipe. Well, duh. That's, clearly, we all know what a recipe is. And there are ingredients. But his way of thinking about it and looking at it has some interesting twists. He's divided recipes into steps because he wants to be able to break things out. And he's also modeled what he calls techniques. So the idea of whisking a thing it's important to capture that a particular step in this recipe is whisking these two ingredients together. And then whenever he talks about an individual recipe, like a particularly delicious way of preparing asparagus, and then here's how you do the fish, those things are gathered together into plates. Not a particular meal, but a plate. It's a setting. It's the proper artful combining of a couple of different pieces of food. And then plates themselves are grouped into what he calls seasons. He believes that there are 3 seasons, not 4, but it's understandable because he lives in Seattle. And he also groups them by varietals. There's a charcuterie section, which I am entirely in favor of, and I'm guessing Dean Barker, who is an avid cheese fan and meats and cheese fan, would love that distinction. But and then on top of it, he's also got media, like photos and videos of, you want to see someone whisking? Awesome, we've got a video of him whisking this particular recipe. And the thing is there's nothing particularly universal about this. There are some elements that every cookbook is probably going to overlap with, but this is a very tangible representation of how that particular chef in this particular work thinks of cooking. And this is sort of like that big, pie in the sky brainstorming, what are the key things we've got? And it gave them a lot to work with. They actually produced way more videos than they thought because the chef turned out to be animated and a great speaker. So they're like, let's film lots of videos. And it's cool. But because they broke this down into all these individual little meaningful pieces, they were able to do tons of stuff with it. They did the iPad, they did the iPad version, they did the web version, they did an actual print version of the cookbook that is just a particular form that they've arranged and collected all of those individual building blocks into. So they really do have pages for the Lark Cookbook, actual physical pages. Another interesting example is the NAMM Foundation, the National Association of Music Merchandisers. If you've ever gone into a music store or purchased an instrument or anything like that, you've interacted with a member of NAMM. There were lots of jokes about never getting out of NAMM during this project and stuff like that, but I'll try to spare you. They are a really cool nonprofit organization that basically just supports music education and lifelong music making and stuff like that. But the problem was they were stuck with a website from 2004, and it was organized, as many nonprofit websites are, entirely around internal org structure, not what people were actually trying to figure out when they visited the NAMM site. It was actually really, really sobering when we first started working with them, and they looked at it and they're like, yep, I'm at the homepage of our website, and I could not figure out what our organization is actually about from looking at this homepage. It was that sort of level of thing. And they knew it was a problem. And solving that, this is actually, by the way, what they came up with after the whole process of identifying their audiences and defining their core messages and stuff like that. It's a lot more focused. You go there and boom, we celebrate and promote the value of music and music education. And at the top, the navigation structures are, what do we do? Why does music matter? Find things in your local community. These are all really tangible things that are tied to specific people they knew were going to be coming to the website and the stuff they knew they were going to be looking for that they weren't able to find very effectively. And this was the kind of modeling work that they ended up doing. They understood that lots of stuff revolved around audiences. In their case, it was parents, teachers, and potential donors. And all of the other stuff that they had on the website really was organized around the things those specific audiences uniquely looked for. With teachers, they had a whole section for tips on how to organize your music education lessons, how to keep students coming back after that, 5 weeks of excitement and stuff like that. For parents, they had a whole section on local community resources. How do you find what the best community for music education is in your state and stuff like that. And for donors, they wanted to communicate lots of information around narratives, the programs we support, the research that we fund, the good that we've accomplished. And they had all of this information sitting there on their website. They already had it there in the form of news releases dumped into the press archive and stuff like that. But stepping back and thinking about those audiences and those messages that they really cared about gave them a framework to organize and collect it and gather it in a way that made sense. And, the actual work wasn't tons of, highfalutin design stuff. It was notepads and documents, little mind maps of just, okay, we've got all this stuff. How do we organize it now? And it worked really well for them. The Tech Guy. Has anybody heard Leo Laporte's Tech Guy radio show? It's a radio call-in show. It's been going for years. It's a 3-hour call-in show on the weekends where a tech guy answers your technical questions. It's cool. Also, their website for 7 years had been a wiki maintained by an intern. And sometimes by listeners who felt, prompted to go in and update the page. And they knew that this was a problem because it was just a giant dumping ground. What constitutes a page for an episode had evolved organically over 7 years and was never really the same. And they even understood very, very clearly what things their listeners actually wanted when they came to the site, but they knew they just weren't delivering it. This is, again, the end result. I like showing the happy, conclusion. The things turned out okay. Don't worry. This is an episode quote page on their new website. You could say, oh, well, that's a big old, mess of content. And it's actually constructed out of tons of different individual pieces of content. You look at it and it's like, oh, here's an episode. Here are the questions that are asked. Here are the guests that were interviewed. under the hood, each one of those is actually captured as an individual piece of content. The episode is actually just an incredibly lightweight wrapper for individual call-in questions, individual news stories that are talked about, guests that get interviewed. Each one of those segments on a show gets broken out into a piece of content that can be searched, it can be indexed, the whole deal. And then all of those get topically categorized so that somebody who comes to the website and says, I want to find out about printers, or gosh darn it, my Wi-Fi router isn't working, can find all throughout the show's history, when have we talked about that stuff? What questions have we answered? And then they also stick the idea of a station in there. Because it being a radio show, where can I actually listen is one of the big questions that they've got. Previously, they had one wiki page where they went in and they meticulously updated every time a station left or arrived. What they're able to do now is just stick up a Google map. You can search by, zip code. Where is a local station? And that's there because they treated each one of those individual pieces as valuable chunks of content. Stations don't get their own page on the website. That wouldn't make sense. It's just a call sign and a link to the station's website and, a city that it lives in. But keeping track of them as individual pieces allowed them to come up with interesting and compelling ways to present the aggregate and to say, what users care about is I need to listen to the show, where can I do it? And all these pieces of content are just a way of us serving that particular need. The final example is one that I'm really fond of because it breaks out of this sort of like big planning mindset of, what kind of content shall we produce? And it actually came out of the BBC that you would think, they would have sort of a really strong, command and control. We'll send our army of strategists and designers at it and we'll figure out what the structure of the site is. But a little while ago, they ended up coming up with something that they called a data pick. Which is a really cool idea, and it wasn't planned. It was just something that they discovered over the course of maintaining their own content. What happened was in a story about honeybee collapse, the colony collapse disorder thing, they ended up producing just a little visualization of, what honeybees do. Why are they important? They produce this much honey, and, a bee's wings beat 200 times a second. It was just sort of filler, information that, everybody loves to stick into a story. But very quickly, what they discovered was everybody wanted these things for their stories. It was a really cool and compelling way to juice up a lot of different stories on the BBC website. And Chris Ashton, in an article on the Responsive News blog, said that it was, a pattern was beginning to develop. What started as a one-off bespoke thing they did for a particular story turned into something that lots and lots of writers and editors were commissioning for different stories because it worked. So what they did was they modeled it. They said, okay, so what are the actual elements that each time we make one of these darn things for people, what are we making? And it was simple. It was that every one of them had a title, every one of them had some text, it had some light formatting so that they could say, here's the big kicker number and the rest is just explanatory text. But then every one of them had an image, some sort of backdrop of a bunch of bees flying or someone baking a pie or whatever. And then there was a special icon that they would always put in there that tied it to the theme of the story or whatever. That is the structure of a data pick. None of these things get a page on the website. It wouldn't make sense. Who wants to say, I've visited the how many times do a bee's wings beat webpage on the BBC? But capturing this little reproducible pattern gave them not just a thing for the technical team to implement, but also a new noun in the vocabulary of the content team to explain what they were trying to produce, what they were trying to create, and what they needed to do in order to deliver a story. And it became super popular. You can actually see these all over the place on the BBC's website, and they're super successful. And you might not even notice that they're the same thing until you start looking at that pattern. You're like, those are data picks. And it also works well with their responsive design. Because it was something that they were doing consistently and were able to describe consistently, their designers were able to come up with ways of handling it on different media. How would this go out on Twitter? How would you tweet out an article that had a data pick in there? I bet we could use the data pick as the social media preview on Twitter. They were able to come up with all those cool ideas for how you do multi-channel stuff because they'd taken the time to recognize and identify those patterns. So The whole idea behind all of this hand-waving I've been doing and talking is the idea that your content is really about small, meaningful pieces, the important chunks. Excuse me. Now, sometimes an important piece of content may be a long-form interview. It could be thousands and thousands of words. But in terms of the page metaphor, that's still a discrete chunk, something that lives at the sub-page level, and a page is a way to present it. The idea is that you think about those pieces, those component elements of the site, the important content chunks that you're creating that have meaning and have value for people, and then you can start thinking of how we assemble this stuff. It helps escape the nasty, like, we've got a beautiful design, what the heck do we put in it, sort of lorem ipsum hell that can very easily happen with design first projects. How many people here are the actual designer for a site? Okay, cool. How many people here are the developer who's actually doing the build out on the content modeling? Okay, wait, you've got a black badge. You don't count. How many people here are like a stakeholder who like gets to make the final hiring and, yes, let's spend $50,000 on that kind of decisions? Okay. A couple of people was like, I can do that. I am empowered. A question that I often find when, dealing with people who are sort of like in the trenches boils down to, isn't this somebody else's job? It's cool to talk about this stuff, but my work is actually making sure the website keeps working every day and that the new stuff goes up and online. And honestly, if I have to say I need a new page to get a thing out there that I need to get out there, well, I'm going to say I need a new page. Isn't thinking about this stuff somebody else's job? No, I would argue. Well, it may be somebody else's job on an org chart or in terms of like the final responsibility for making sure X and Y happen. It may be someone else's technical responsibility, but I think anyone who deals with the meat and potatoes work of the content of a website on a day in, day out basis, it's really critical to the work that you do, and you have knowledge about that stuff that those other people don't. Yeah, excuse me. Like if you're in a small business or on a small team, you may not have the luxury of kicking that can down the road to the development team. I remember a while ago, we were talking to a client and we were like, oh, well, you'd probably want to talk to your designer about that. Oh, our designer? Fancy. We don't have a designer. We've got a guy who actually knows how to make graphics. That's it. In a lot of organizations, there are people who have to wear lots of hats. And that multiple hat wearing person, who here is that multiple hat wearing person? Yeah, there's a lot more multi-hat wearing person hands than there are, I am the development team manager hands in here. You have to understand these things because you exist at the nexus of all of these different considerations. You are the one who has to live with the long-term repercussions of maintaining stuff that wasn't really built in the right way. Sometimes the idea is that, these questions can be answered by bringing in an outside consultant, hiring a strategist or bringing in, a firm that can come up with the grand plan for this kind of stuff. But the funny thing is and I have been that person who gets brought in for those conversations, they are going to ask you about this stuff anyways. They don't magically understand the ins and outs and the essence of your business, and they don't have an intuitive grasp of, well, every Thursday we do kind of try to make a personal sounding article about one of the staff, but we just think about it that way. There's nothing in the system that actually enables that. We just think about it that way. They don't magically know those kinds of things. And if you understand that, and you've already been thinking about those kinds of patterns, those kinds of intentions, and those kinds of audiences that you're gearing towards, you're already ahead of the game when they start asking you questions. Anyone you're working with, whether it's writers, whether it's developers, whether it's designers, they need that kind of big picture to do their work. And as the person who's on the ground in the trenches, you're actually one of the best people to understand and figure that stuff out and think it through, because you're exposed to the raw mess of it all on a day-to-day basis. So the work of figuring that out is really, really important, not just for someone else to finish, but for you to figure out. Content at its heart is about meaning and communicating to other people. Planning the individual pieces before you just throw stuff onto pages is going to give you a big win. Because ultimately, those individual pieces, the stories, the images, the personalities, that's what people care about, no matter where it lands on a particular page. That's it. That's all I got. Thank you very much.